Hello, I'm Barbara Kessel, a retired community college teacher of English, no surprise, and an avid reader of Bellevue Literary Review. And I am honored today to be able to talk directly to the best author that I have read in years, Rachel Mann, who wrote Vital Signs. I want to say that from the moment you start reading this story, you are the narrator who is using the second person you. So, in two ways, you are the narrator. And the narrator keeps you close throughout this story of a miscarriage. Rachel, could you read some of it?
Yes, thank you, Barbara. My name is Rachel Mann, and this is Vital Signs. You wake to the sound of the nurse entering your room to take your vitals, because you are, despite the fog of your brief early morning sleep, still alive. Not that you're aware it is morning. There is no day or night for you now, not since the rush of bloody fluid between your legs. You are confined in a hidden wing of the maternity ward, down the hall from where the live babies are born. With a tight expression and few words, the nurse takes your temperature and blood pressure. Later, your husband tells you there's a sign on the door reminding the staff of the solemnity of this room. You feel like an outsider, a foreigner, and not just because you're an American living in London. You're not supposed to be here in the maternity ward. Not yet. There will be no happy cries, no rigorous infant howls. You know this because life, in the form of blood and fluid, has been leaking out of you for days. Your body is turning from an incubator to a tomb. There's nothing you can do to stop it. You can no more help your own flesh and blood from leaking out of you than you can stop your monthly bleeding from doing the same. It's been less than 22 weeks. At intake, both of your hearts are beating, but the baby's vitals are unstable. A fetus ejected from the womb now, just past halfway gestated, will not survive. Even if there is some way to keep it in for another couple weeks, to squeeze your legs, say, or to bargain with your God, who seems to have abandoned you, even then the child will suffer. If it lives for a day or a week, it will suffer. If it lives for longer, it will suffer more. You are bleeding, but vitally, you are alive. Your temperature is elevated. Your uterus is contracting unevenly, as if frightened and confused. If the infection is allowed to spread, you could die. You are not a doctor. You don't know the exact risks. You suspect the doctors don't either. But you know you can't die. You have 2 little girls at home. You beseech, make this end, please.
I have read Vital Signs a number of times, and I cry every time. I have read it again on purpose in order to try to penetrate the craft that you used, Rachel, to make the reader feel so close to you. And so I want to ask you what choices you made as a writer to achieve that effect that the reader can share your experience.
Thank you. It's interesting. I think that because this was an exercise in creative nonfiction, I was telling a story about something that really happened to me, and it's not something that I usually do. I'm mostly a fiction writer. And so I actually wrote this piece as fiction first. And I had a trusted friend, another writer who writes mostly creative nonfiction, who said to me, "This is a story that you have to, you really should tell as nonfiction. It needs to be told as your own story." And it was so uncomfortable for me to do that, that I almost needed a little bit of artifice for me to feel comfortable telling it. And I, of course, wrote it in every possible point of view. I wrote it in third person. I wrote it in first person. And I read I happened to read a very personal essay that was published in second person while I was working on this piece, while I was kind of stuck on this piece, to be honest. And I thought, this might be it. This might be what I need to get past this block I'm having about telling this story in a way that's it's so personal, but it also feels impossible that it happened, and that I experienced it, and that it's so hard to talk about. So it was one of those moments where trying all the different possibilities as a writer is what led to kind of the cracking open of telling the story.
That is so interesting to me because I think by being a fiction writer first and then trying all these different points of view, you ended up not only with a closeness, but with a distance at the same time. That you
I think,
in good fiction.
yeah, I think that distance is it's interesting. It's important. It was important to me somehow to foist this onto, maybe that's what writing is, right? I'm trying to give this experience to other people that seems impossible to describe.
Right.
And so using the second person, I literally was handing it to you. The other thing that I didn't tell you about this is that I started this piece in a one-off workshop, masterclass with Carmen Maria Machado, the amazing writer who writes both fiction and nonfiction. And there was a prompt. And the prompt was to write up to and towards a moment of violence. And it was just, it was a 2-hour class, and we were sitting in a room and writing together.
Right.
And I didn't have time to think, and this was just what came to me. And this was something that I'd been writing about, this experience, for years, very unsuccessfully. I mean, unsuccessfully in that I never did anything with any of the pieces that I wrote, but I was always coming back to it as kind of this this experience that I didn't know how to get on paper. And there was something about that prompt, about thinking about it as an act of violence, which almost sounds passive, like something that happens to you. And I was like, okay, let me think of, and that, I think, is how I ended up with all of, I think, the introduction, the being in bed, the thinking about how did I get here. I wanted to ask you a question as well, because I often think about the idea that the more specific a writer is about their own experience, the more likely a reader will connect to the story that's on the page. And I was wondering if there were some details that particularly drew you in when you were reading the piece.
Well, I think being pinned to the bed and having the nurse come in and take your vital signs it drew me in right away, because I have had experiences in the hospital also. And then the fact that there was a sign on the outside of the door that set you apart from all the other people that were in the same ward, that was very that resonated with me. And I think that's an outsider, a non-belonging experience that is universal. Everyone's experienced that at some point, whether they're in hospital or not, of just being set apart with a label that says you don't belong here. So that was important. I resonated with that detail about your I think you said your uterus was being squeezed like a juicer. And well, I've never had a baby, let alone a miscarriage. And but I had endometriosis, which is like that and very painful. And so that detail resonated with me. And then at the end, when you say you stroke the baby's red hair, that was so touching. The fact that it was red hair that set it apart from other babies made it, and then the fact that its remains could be carried away in a lunchbox. That's what sticks with me.
Yeah, it's like the specifics about human experience, about women's experience, I think that often don't get told. Like you said, endometriosis, it's not something something so many people experience, but maybe few share about.
Right.
I believe so strongly in telling the stories that women fail to tell or keep to themselves. And I think that's one reason why I kept coming back to this story, is because it's not the kind of thing you talk about in polite conversation.
Right.
It gets swept under very quickly after the experience, but for somebody who lives through it, it's never forgotten. The details have stayed with me for many years. This wasn't a recent experience, so.
But it was important to me to read about a miscarriage because I never had read about that before, or known somebody, a personal friend who experienced that or talked about it. And I read a lot of stories about births and babies, but
So
not
this was a very unique experience in that I don't consider it a miscarriage. It was a stillbirth.
okay.
And I think that's really what was so dramatic about it, and that I, at the time, couldn't believe I had to go through, that there wasn't an alternative, was a shock to me. And still, when I think about it, or when I reread the story, which I had to do many, many times in the process of getting it ready to submit
Mm-hmm.
to Bellevue Literary Review, and then also in the kind of amazing editorial process with their editors. It was every time that part of it shocks me. And I think that it's this way in which, even now, in modern times, these kind of horrors of being human persist.
Yes.
And this is one of them.
A question I'd like to ask you is about your writing process, and you've already talked about that uh, a bit, but I have to say I'm glad to know that it began in a writer's workshop where you're writing with other people, because I do that too, and it's amazingly generative to be doing that. But I wanted to ask you how many times and you had to revise it, and what I know you said you set it aside, but what um, how did you handle it emotionally to have to revise it so many times?
I think it helped that it happened at different it wasn't all consistent, but yeah, I think I knew, as you probably do sometimes too, when you're in one of those writing workshops and you get a prompt that just like speaks to you. I knew I had something,
Mm-hmm.
really, from the moment I walked out of that 2-hour workshop. I knew I had started something that was going to stick, and I kept working on it. But I did get discouraged at times that I wasn't telling the story in the right way, or that the protagonist wasn't coming through, and I did put it aside. And I do this often with stories. And then I had kind of that realization about working on the different points of view that helped me move forward. I cried so many times reading and rereading this story. Um, I don't think I've ever worked on anything that did that to me.
Mm-hmm.
And I'm amazed by people who write consistently and over again about their own painful experiences, because as a fiction writer, I try sometimes to just get out of my own space and inhabit other characters, maybe for the freedom that allows, but also because it's hard to reflect on our own
Yeah.
hardest moments. Um, when the piece was accepted to Bellevue Literary Review and I realized I was going to have to keep working on the story, it was hard, for sure. I was like, oh, I think I felt done with that. Now I have to go back into that space every time. But I will say this: I felt like this piece was in great hands from the very beginning. I think that the editors were. I felt like it landed in the right place. Like this is a journal that understands why we need to write about the physical experience of being human. And so there was mutual trust, and it was amazing to go back in and really it was very fine tuning. It wasn't anything major, but it was an experience that I think where I had to be open and willing to be in this space long enough to make sure that this piece would do the most it could do in terms of having an effect on the reader. And that's why it's so gratifying to hear from you that you were touched by it.
Yeah.
So thank you.
Well, I think Bellevue Literary Review is unique to me among literary magazines because it stays on that topic. I really appreciate hearing from you about um, writing this kind of a thing. Um, I have been trying to write for some years a piece about having a stroke and being in the hospital for 12 days with a stroke. And so talking to you gives me renewed inspiration to go back to it because I know that I have something. But it takes so much longer than when you're in a writing group and you just read what you just wrote. The process of revision is long, and I'm not used to that.
It is. I think if it's heartening to hear, I think there's so many people who will automatically relate to that story and want to read it. So keep going.
I will.